ادع إلى سبيل ربك بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة وجادلهم بالتي هي أحسن إن ربك هو أعلم بمن ضل عن سبيله وهو أعلم بالمهتدين.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Today, inshallah, as the PowerPoint shows, I will be talking about intellectual challenges for Muslims studying Islam in a Western environment. I will begin by introducing myself, introducing the topic, defining what it means for a Muslim to be studying Islam in a Western environment, and what we actually mean by intellectual challenges as well. Inshallah, I will go on to then talk about ideologies and epistemology. I will inshallah define these as well, and then conclude with solutions of how Muslims living in countries such as England and America and in Western countries, how we can deal with these intellectual challenges when we go into universities, when we go into Western environments where we are taught Islamic sciences instead of the traditional madrasa system, the traditional system of traditional studies, or the classical methodology, how Muslims are confronted with a different methodology, a different epistemology, and how they learn Islam within the university environment. So inshallah, I will be talking about this today. The thoughts which I've gathered today, everything that we'll be talking about are thoughts which I myself have gone through, the personal experience which I have gone through as when I was studying Islam within a university environment. These thoughts are gathered from my teachers, what my teachers have taught me, what I myself have gone through, the readings which I've done, and many other aspects which have been collated and tonight will be presented to you in this talk, inshallah. So I'll begin by introducing myself, telling you a little bit about myself. Before I start, I want to thank the Dawah Project for inviting me here today and allowing me to speak, and also Dr. Abu Ishi for organizing this event, and everyone else, all the other speakers who have spoken today. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, and inshallah we shall start. The background, I'm from England. I'm from the north of England, from a small town called Blackburn. In this town, from a young age you were sent to the madrasa. At the age of 5 or 6, you were sent to the madrasa to learn the basics of the deen, to learn the basics of the religion. So you were sent to learn how to pray salah, the 5 fundamental pillars of Islam. You were sent there to learn the Arabic alphabet, to learn how to read the Quran and basics as such. But at the age of 14 or 15, you will in this madrasa system, you then specialize in terms of if you want to become a Hafidh al-Quran, if you want to maybe pursue the route of the alim course, become an alim, pursue a certain science in the religion. So at the age of 14, I stopped in this madrasa system. So I went from the age of 5 or 6, I was sent by my parents, and at the age of 14, I stopped going to the madrasa. My parents told me to focus on my Western academic studies. This then led me to the University of Leeds. I went through the whole high school system in England where you study the GCSEs, you study the subjects, you go to college, you go to the sixth forms as they call them, and then after these 7 or so years, you choose a path within a university. So I ended up at a university where I studied BA in English and Creative Writing for 3 years. And in this time, through all my readings, through all the novels that I read, all the literature that I read, I would always in my spare time return back to reading Islamic literature. I would always find myself coming back to studying the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ maybe, or to look at different opinions within the religion on certain issues. So my interest, my heart really lied with studying the religion of Islam. Now what I found was after my 3 years of studying English and Creative Writing, I took a year out. Within that year I gathered my thoughts, I worked, And eventually I came to applying for the master's program in the University of Leeds in Islamic Studies. Now before I applied for this program, I spoke to a lot of traditional teachers. By traditional, I mean the teachers who have studied in the Eastern methodology. They've studied in places like Saudi Arabia, they've studied in the subcontinent, they've studied in these countries, and now they're doing da'wah in England through everything they've learned. So I spoke to these teachers, I took some advice off them, I asked them, should I go forward with this studying of Islam within a university environment? As I was, the only thing I had been exposed to at that stage was the madrasa system, in terms of rote memorization, in terms of sitting at the feet of the scholars. But now I was going into an environment which was completely new. I was going to be exposed to different methodologies, different ways of learning the religion, whether it was hadith, whether it was fiqh, whether it was the language of Arabic even. It was a different methodology. Eventually they said, go forward. The teachers told me, go for it. Go for the program, go study in the university environment, but be careful. Tread with caution. They said in the evenings, sit with the traditional scholars and make sure you get yourself a grounding within the religion before you approach the Western methodology. Now this really is the crux of what I'm going to be talking about tonight, because everything I'm going to be talking about is from personal experience, the conversation I've had with the people I studied with, the conversation I've had with my teachers, the conversation I've had with those who were studying in the traditional institutes. In England we have institutes called Dar al-Ulum, and in these institutes you find the teachers teaching the students in a traditional methodology, where you will go through a systematic approach of 6 years. You'll go through a systematic method of learning the language first and foremost, and then moving on from the language to whichever field you want to specialize in, so maybe fiqh, or maybe hadith, or whether it's history, and you'll specialize in these within the 6 years. Now I chose not to go to these institutes. My parents chose that for me, actually at the age of 14. I chose not to do that, and in the end I ended up going to a university to study my religion. Now what I found was when I would have these conversations with my peers who had studied in the traditional methodology, they would have a different approach to, for example, hadith or to fiqh maybe. They would have a different methodology, and I would ask them, where would you draw the line when it came to studying the religion? Where would the questions stop? You would ask many questions. In the Western environment, they encourage you to ask and ask and ask. Ask. The more questions you ask, the more critical you are, the better your mind is. This is the methodology which they instill within you. Now, when I'm coming out of this university and I'm speaking to my peers, to my friends who are studying in the traditional methods, this is new information to them. They would not be encouraged to ask and keep asking questions. Rather, they would be told, this is the way. Maybe they had a few questions, but there was a line drawn. Certain things were not compromised. Now this is what I want to talk about today. This is very important to the area which I'm going to talk about, because when we approach Islamic sciences, when our Muslim youth approach the Islamic sciences in universities, there has to be a line drawn. A compromise has to be made at a certain point. I will come to this later, and I will delve into this as we go on, but the ideologies which a person is confronted with in a university should not be ideologies which Muslims shy away from. We should not be scared of going into the university environment as Muslims to study Islam, because historically we've never been people to not confront the reality of the world and conflicting ideologies. However, when one approaches the university environment attempting to study Islam without any form of traditional grounding, then they find that they become confused. They become very confused. I've met Muslims myself who will go into the university without any form of basic traditional learning, and they will come out the other way. They come out the university after their degrees or after their bachelors or their masters, etc., and they're confused. They will find themselves very confused. They'll have too many questions to ask. They might have 10 questions when they went in. They come out with another 20, 30 questions about the deen, about what is this, what is the truth, etc. So today I will focus on these things, and inshallah I will clear up a lot of these things. Right now I want to talk about two issues here. There's two words which I was taught by one of the professors at my university, the noumenon versus the phenomenon. The noumenon, as I'm showing here on the PowerPoint, is discussing the view from within the thing itself, with an inside perspective, as the Islamic scholars should have. Now the noumenon discusses the view from the thing itself, meaning from an inside perspective. The traditional scholars of the East have traditionally carried this view throughout history. This was a philosophy philosophized by Immanuel Kant. But this is the noumenon view is a view which the Muslim scholars have always had. We are from the inside, we're speaking, looking out. Whereas the phenomenon view, which Immanuel Kant describes, is a thing as it appears to an observer. So for example, the likes of some academics who teach this field in the universities, they have ventured down a path where they are looking out into the Islamic. So you'll get critics of the hadith sciences, for example, the likes of Goldziher and the likes of Shasht. These people have never sat with the traditional scholars of hadith. They've never sat with the people who studied hadith and taken it from a chain, as the Islamic tradition dictates. And then these people came and they criticized the hadith. They criticized the oral tradition of the hadith. Our Muslim scholars have dealt with them. They've written extensively about Goldziher and they've written extensively about Shasht. However, Muslims, when they go into these environments, not knowing the traditional sciences, not having a grounding, they will be confronted with a phenomenal view. A phenomenon view where you'll have an outsider talking about the sciences as if they have an expertise in the science. Now they will criticize and criticize and criticize. So for example, an example is Joseph Goldziher. He talks about the hadith sciences. Now in these sciences he claims that the oral tradition is not one which is true, basically. He breaks it down saying that it does not exist, etc. Whereas our Muslim scholars, the traditional scholars, have dealt with these Western Orientalist attacks on the sciences, basically. And what you will have is students being exposed to these things, coming out, if they don't know the traditional answers, coming out of these degrees very confused. They'll be very confused, thinking, is the hadith science reliable? Is this hadith reliable? Is that hadith reliable? They will question every single strand of hadith science. In the end, I've met people who completely disregard the hadith science. And this is because of these things, because of these issues. They completely feel that the hadith science, what they've been taught in university, is true, whereas what they are taught by the traditional scholars is not necessarily true. Now today, as mentioned, I will discuss the challenge of ideologies at universities. I will look at different approaches in the Islamic methodology and in the Western methodology. I will compare the two methodologies. And then finally I will conclude on how Muslims should approach these sciences when it comes to a university environment. This is what I'm going to talk about today. It's a brief touching on this topic. It's not something, I'm not an expert in this field. I'm talking about these things from personal experience, as mentioned, from conversations I've had. You will find experts in this field who discuss this extensively. But inshallah, we will all be able to take some benefit from today's talk. So what does it mean to study Islam within a Western environment? We have to begin by defining what it means to study Islam. Traditionally, the scholars have never been shy to incorporate all the branches of knowledge into the sphere of Islam. Here, the entire endeavor for the Islamization of knowledge is based on the assumption that the knowledge produced by the West is un-Islamic. Now, we have to be honest here and say that this presumption in itself is wrong. It is incorrect to divide the knowledge into Islamic and un-Islamic. The whole worldly knowledge can't be categorized as un-Islamic. You may have differing ideologies and academic channels, but Islam, in fact, does not believe in the dichotomy of religious and secular knowledge. Muslim thinkers in the past had categorized as un-Islamic only those branches of knowledge which did not stand to the test of intellect and experiment, such as magic, sorcery, soothsaying, etc. These were the only branches which were classed as not intellectual, not something which should be studied at all, but something which can't be studied. Otherwise, all intellectual and experimental branches of knowledge were always appreciated by the Muslim scholars. And then it said, I've written here to understand the objectives of why it is you are studying. Now, I will come to this later on, but just a brief touching, we have to know the purposes of why we are going in to study Islam. Now, if we're going into these university environments to study Islam just to get to get famous or to try to have an in-depth understanding of Islam, in all honesty, I don't think you're going to get it from these institutes. Unless you, like I've mentioned before and many times before, unless you have yourself a traditional grounding and you know the basics of the religion before you go into these environments. But before, according to what I said before, he's saying here studying is a holistic and integrative approach to integrate the various parts of a human being. If an education of something does not have anything to do with the psychological, intellectual, and most importantly the spiritual aspect of a human being, then this is not an education. Now what you'll find in the universities, it can be argued that the spiritual aspect is missing within the university environment. You may find a psychological and intellectual engagement, but when it comes to the spiritual aspect of things, the Arabic word tarbiyah, the nurturing of the soul, you'll rarely find this within the university environment. The studying within an Islamic framework, as we shall see, provides and nurtures to all of these in order to bring one closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This should be the purpose of studying the religion. It's not simply to go there to learn a bunch of formalities, to learn the sciences and come out. The purpose of it, the objective of it, should bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It should bring you closer to the sunnah of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to understand the deen as it was delivered to us, to understand the deen as it has been understood by the traditional scholars. Now one may argue that these issues, these sciences such as Quran, Hadith, Fiqh, Aqidah, one may argue that these are being offered in the university environment. But like we said, the objectives of why one studies these are not there. Now if the objectives are not there in the first place, then you're going to stumble at the very first hurdles. You're going to stumble as soon as you go in. As soon as you go to study these things, your objectives are wrong. Your aims to go in and why you're studying these things are wrong. Whereas in the traditional methodology, they teach you, before you start, they teach you your objectives should be, as I've written here, to get closer to Allah, to understand the deen so you can act upon your knowledge. Not simply have the knowledge, but to act upon the knowledge that you've gained. This is a very important factor when it comes to comparing the two methodologies. Now, I've written here that it can be reduced to a very simple meaning in terms of a Western environment, meaning the university. Today I'm only focusing on the university, the conversations which take place in the universities, the conversations which take place on university campuses, within the classrooms, between the teachers. This is what I mean by a Western environment. And to study Islam, as mentioned here, are the sciences. I'm specifically talking about studying the sciences of Islam. Now I'm not saying here that the classical methodology in the modern day is completely flawless. The classical methodology of studying Islam is not completely flawless. Of course not. Sometimes we find ourselves stuck at semantics, on surface meanings, and we find it difficult to get to the pragmatical meaning of things. However, this epistemological framework, which I will explain, has stood the test of time and has produced scholars of great caliber within the Eastern philosophical world and within the West as well. So the Muslim communities within the universities are found now, when they step into these universities, they're found challenged by a completely different framework, by a completely different approach and a completely different worldview. I will discuss and compare the two epistemological frameworks, and then I will talk about some solutions of how to approach these sciences. I've just mentioned this, a Western environment today. I'm talking about the university campus. Most importantly, we need to define intellectual challenges. This in itself, intellectual challenges, this can be something which someone can do a PhD on or a master's thesis on. It's a very broad topic, the topic of intellectual challenges. But today I want to specifically discuss epistemology, the way knowledge is drawn, the sources from which knowledge is taken, and ideology. Ideology in terms of what a person thinks, what a person's worldview is when they go into the university environment. Now, what does epistemology mean? Before we move on, I think it's very important that we define what epistemology means. I've written here, epistemology is the study of the nature and scope of knowledge and justified belief. It analyzes the nature of knowledge and how it relates to similar notions as truth, such as truth, belief, and justification. It also deals with the means of production of knowledge as well as skepticism about different knowledge claims. It is essentially about issues having to do with the creation and dissemination of knowledge. in particular areas of inquiry. So for example, the epistemological sources for the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, you'll find are the Quran, the Hadith, the Tabaqat, the history. These things are the sources of knowledge from which we take information and we build and we understand the life of the Prophet ﷺ. These are the epistemological sources. Now in the university you will have different epistemological sources. When you're studying in the madrasa, you are taught these are the sources from which we take our knowledge. We take our knowledge from the Quran. First and foremost, the Quran, revelation. Our first source isn't the human intellect. Whereas in the Western university, they will tell you that the human intellect overrides. If something does not fit in your rational mind, then this cannot comprehend to the truth. This cannot relate to the truth. You will be told these things when you go to study, whichever branch it is you're studying in the university, you will be told that these things, the first and foremost epistemological source is the human intellect. Whereas for the Muslims, the first source is the Quran and the Hadith. That's where we take our first knowledge from, the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasul. And then we go from there. Everything else is secondary. The human intellect is secondary. The human ability is secondary. The books of fiqh and everything else, they go back to Sunnah, they go back to the Quran, but these all come second. First and foremost is wahi, revelation. Whereas in the Western universities, you will find that the students are confronted with a different approach. Now, intellectual challenge of ideologies. Ideology, what do I mean by ideology? Ideology, as it's taught in the university, is to what extent is something true? This is what they are discussing with you. They want to provide to you an Aristotelian approach where, according to his philosophy, something is only true. This is the philosophy you were taught in the university. This is one of the first epistemological ideologies you were taught. Something is only true when it corresponds to reality. So you look at everything around you, you look at the social truths, you look at the truth which maybe truths about economic truths, financial truths, whatever it may be. If it does not correspond to these truths, if it does not correspond to this reality, then this cannot be true. This is what the approach, the ideology which you are taught in the university. That something is only true when it corresponds to the world around you. Now if it doesn't make sense in the world around you, this cannot be true. This is the ideology which you are imprinted with when you approach these environments. There's a skeptical system present where the student studying will be led to believe that truth meaning capital T, truth with a capital T, the Quran and Sunnah, is simply coherent in the confines of this system. So if the Quran and the Sunnah does not fit in with the world around you, if certain aspects of the Quran does not fit in with the world around you, then we should question these aspects. This is the ideology which is propagated and is a challenge for students going into these universities. Now one may ask, why are you criticizing these university environments? And I'm not criticizing, I'm stating facts. This is the truth. This is what I went through when I went to study Islam in a university. They were telling you can question everything. You can question certain aspects, you can question this, you can question that. But as mentioned before, a line has to be drawn. For Muslims, we know that our capital truth, our T with a capital truth, is the Quran. That's where we get our truth from. Our truth isn't first related to the world around us. Our truth is first the Quran, and then we look at the world around us. This is how the Muslims approach these sciences. Now dealing with ideologies, it says I've written here, there are many ideas out there. There are many ideas out there, development theory, marriage, gender rights, these are all ideas. But when it comes to ideology, it's much more complicated. It's the background of your brain. It's the way you see the world. Ideology is your Weltanschauung, as they say in German, your world view. And people aren't usually aware of this until they are made aware of this. It's the assumptions which you may have whilst you're growing up. It's what your parents may have taught you, what you gained from your days at school, from your conversations with your friends, your teachers, etc. It's what you believe in without knowing you believe in it. So now some of the ideologies you may encounter in the university, because universities in England and America and these places, universities are seen as the battleground for ideologies. Who has the better ideology? Who has the smarter ideology? If you have the better ideology, you are this clever one, you are the smarter one. If you can question and criticize everything, you are the one coming on top. This is the universities are the battleground for ideologies, and they promote, because they are seen as the battleground for these places, because they are seen as places of liberal thought. This comes into question that can a Muslim going into these universities, will it conflict with the ideology of a Muslim? Will it conflict with Islam? The whole idea of being liberal, completely liberal in your thought, meaning you can question whatever you want. You have to be liberal. You have to be free to completely think what you may think. So as Muslims, it's very likely that we won't share in most of these ideas, this idea of liberalism, and hence this will quickly become an area of conflict. Quickly you'll find that the student who goes to study these subjects within the university environment, they will be confronted with a conflicting ideology. They will start questioning their own identity. What does it mean to be a Muslim in a Western country, in England or in America? What does it mean to be a Muslim studying Islam in a university? They will start asking themselves these questions. And it happens quite often, a lot actually. I've witnessed it myself. I've got friends who have asked themselves these questions. But when they go back to the traditional scholars, when they go back to people who have studied the religion in depth, they will find the answers. But in the university, through having these conversations, I really don't think that they will be able to find these answers, in all honesty. In one sense, universities may be the ideal places as you sit and discuss things all the time. So you have that freedom to discuss whatever you want. But you may be sat with a bunch of people who don't want to talk about what you're talking about. They don't want to engage in conversation regarding the truth of the Quran, regarding the Sunnah, regarding the Ahadith, regarding these things. They may disregard it. And as mentioned, this will result in you questioning your identity as a Muslim. What does it mean to be a Muslim? What does it mean to study these things, to have knowledge of these things? You will end up asking these things. Now, liberal ideology puts emphasis on reason. This is a very important point. Reason in the university is seen as the bastion of all knowledge. It's seen as the main point of departure. Now, something has to be reasonable. Everything has to have a grounding of reason, or else its class is not valid. If something is not reasonable in the university environment, it's just class is not valid. However, clearly in Islam, this is not our ideology and never has been. But this does not mean that we be intellectually lazy. Our scholars, this does not mean we shy away from these things or we're scared of entering these environments, because we need our scholars to enter these environments. We need our scholars to confront these ideologies. We need, because there are Muslim youth in this day and age, regardless of what you say, who are going into these environments, who are going into university environments, and they're studying whatever they may study, anthropology, postmodernism, etc., philosophy, etc. But they will start asking these questions. Now, you get people, you get some scholars who maybe just enjoy sitting in the masajid and not facing these issues. They don't understand that the Muslim youth in the Western countries, whether they're going to universities to study Islam or any other subject, are going to face challenges which will force them to confront their foundational beliefs. You can't stop the students from going into university and studying these things. It's a basic fact that you can't stop the students from going into university and studying what they want to study. Students may take biology courses, evolutionary courses, postmodernism courses, philosophy, theology, where their faith may get shaken. This isn't some idea which may happen. This is an idea which is happening. This is something which is happening now in England and America and these countries. In our Western countries, this is happening at the moment. We have to be able to produce scholars with an academic acumen, and by academic I mean a Western academic acumen, who can answer the intellectual onslaughts that Islam is receiving. This is just an extension of what I've been talking about. It says here you have an ideology of promoting liberalism. As mentioned here, reason seems to be the foundation of everything. In the university environment, you'll find that reason, as mentioned, is the base for everything. I've written here, we can't simply be intellectually lazy and disregard these ideas, but rather we should with caution be able to rebut these ideologies, as the great personalities of the past have done. This isn't something new which I'm talking about. This isn't something which has not been discussed before. In the history of Islam, our scholars have, and they still continue to do so, read the books of the people attacking the religion. They will read them and they will answer their questions. They will answer their questions on ideology. They will answer their questions on philosophy. They will answer their questions on the basic sciences of the religion. They will do this, and they continue to do this. The scholars in university, my two teachers who taught me, one of my teachers, my hadith teacher for example, he had read extensively on the people who attacked the hadith, the science of hadith, and he's answered them extensively as well. He wasn't scared to do this, and he has a very solid grounding in traditional sciences as well. Now, this table is it's a very important table for us to look at, as it discusses and it describes the difference in the two worldviews. So here we're talking about the Islamic worldview and the Western worldview. By Western, I mean the Western academic worldview. This is taken from Dr. Amin, the professor of Islamic thought and civilization. And he discusses this after extensive research. He talks about the Islamic worldview, because these worldviews, after looking at these worldviews, these lead to epistemological approaches. Now if we look at the Islamic worldview, our first source is the divine guidance provided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through His apostles, through the prophets. Whereas the Western worldview focuses on the human intellect and senses. The concept of the human being, a humble servants. We have a concept that we are the humble servants of our Lord, who submit to His commandments unconditionally. Whereas the concept of the human being in the Western world, in the Western academic sense, is that we are sovereign and fully independent to lead the lives that we wish, or to lead the lives that they wish. The concept, for example, of the universe, of the world, of the universe, is that we believe as Muslims, our sole belief is that Allah is the sole creator and sustainer of the universe, and He has vested mankind with limited authority to manipulate in the universe. The life in the hereafter has priority than this life. Life in the hereafter has priority over this life. Whereas in the academic circles, in the universities, you get a view, a concept of the universe, that the universe is the outcome of natural laws, which also regulate its existence. So these laws are the ones that regulate its existence. It's not a Lord, it's not a one God. Human beings enjoy full freedom on the earth and are free to lead the lives they wish in accordance to their will. The worldly life is an end. That's it. The world life, you live your life and that ends there. For us, we have the afterlife, which we think, which is our world view. It's our background to our brain. It's what we learn, it's what we taught, it's what we naturally believe in through our experiences in life. The concept of a deity. Mankind, we believe, has been created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who alone is the Lord, the sustainer of all creation, all powerful, and He possesses all authority. Whereas the concept of the deity in the academic circles, in the Western academic circles, you will find that the faith in something, faith in a God, faith in a religion, faith in Islam, Christianity, etc., is an affair to be dealt with behind closed doors. It's a private affair. Every individual is at liberty to live the way he likes. This isn't something which incorporates social and political structure. For them, the religious affair is something completely private. Now, the goal of life, as from the Islamic worldview, is that a human being is required to lead his life in this world in obedience of the divine injunctions on the model set by Allah's Messenger ﷺ, to earn Allah's pleasure in the hereafter. The goal of life, you'll find in the Western academic circles which they propagate, is that attainment of every success and maximum worldly pleasure at any cost and in any manner in this world, at any manner in this world. Now this naturally, when you have these worldviews, naturally this will lead to a difference in epistemology, a difference in where you take your knowledge from, a difference in the sources of knowledge. You have this worldview, naturally is going to lead you towards having a difference in epistemology. So for example, the sources of knowledge for Muslims, the first and foremost, primary is the Quran and the Sunnah. Secondary, a limited and subordinate role of human intellect and the senses. Whereas in the Western epistemology, when you go to study the religion, or when you go to study any science in the Western university environment, the first source of knowledge is the human intellect and the human senses. It's not necessarily wahi. It's observation and experience. The secondary is religion, and the role of religion comes secondary. It comes second. The objectives of knowledge, as mentioned before, I will come back to this, but the branches of knowledge. If we move on to the third one, the branches of knowledge. The first one is the revealed knowledge, the Quran and the Sunnah. Knowledge related to revelation and its implementation. For example, the language of Arabic, first and foremost. The other sciences, Muslim jurisprudence. Different disciplines of knowledge that are based on divine revelation as well as human intellect. So for example, you have psychology, politics, economics, and then finally, disciplines of knowledge mainly based on human intellect and senses. So for the majority part, they are based on human intellect. This sciences such as medicine, engineering, etc. Now if we compare that to the Western epistemological approach, we see that various disciplines of worldly knowledge such as natural, physical, hard sciences. If we look, focus on B, religious knowledge is put secondary. Religious knowledge comes second. This is purely a personal affair. This isn't seen as something, as mentioned before, that incorporates the whole world. It is a personal affair. It's an affair with you and your family behind closed doors. This isn't something which you propagate in the public sphere. The purpose of education is a very important one at the bottom. As Muslims, the purpose of education we see is to develop personalities of individuals in a way that they become faithful servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is the purpose of education. It isn't simply to know a bunch of facts and to relay them one after the other. It should bring you closer to your Lord. This is the purpose of education, as we're taught traditionally. Whereas when you enter the university environment to, for example, study Islam, it's simply to rear up a human being as a completely free and independent being, capable of achieving maximum worldly senses and worldly pleasures. Now going back to the objectives of knowledge, when you approach the Islamic sciences in the traditional methodologies, in the madaris, in the madrasa for example, or even if you come to institutes around the world from Malaysia to Medina to Islamabad, Egypt, etc., the teachers will first and foremost make this clear to you, the objectives of learning, the objectives of knowledge, why it is that you are studying something. Why are you studying this science? Why do you want to study this? Do you want to get famous? Do you want to speak on platforms? Do you want to just relay simple information? What is the purpose of knowledge? Now when you go into university environment, you're not taught first and foremost, what is the purpose? Why are you here? You ask a youngster now at the age of 18, at the age of 17, entering a university environment, you can ask them, why is it that you are going to a university? What do you want to learn? What do you want to get out of the university experience? They will say back to you, I want to get a job at the end of it, I want to make money at the end of it. They won't really understand that you go to university, you should be going to study something to broaden your horizon, to understand something in depth and to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to get closer to your deen, to get closer to the sunnah of Rasulullah, to understand that Rasulullah wasn't a static model, but rather he was a dynamic character for all times and all ages. So the objectives of knowledge is very important, and it's a crucial factor when educating the Muslim youth in England and America and Canada and the Western countries. This is a very important factor which is missing in the university environment when you go to study any Islamic science. It says here, I've written here that success in the worldly life is the objective of knowledge. For them, you study something, you study a certain science, usually if you can make money out of it in the end, then it's classed as a success. Now some of the conclusions which we can take from the framework which I've just shown is that knowledge is never value neutral. It is always influenced by the worldview and the religious, moral and social cultural milieu of the society which it absorbs unconsciously, mostly without being noticed by others. This again relates back to the worldview which we gain. The second one, the Western epistemology, the Western way of deriving knowledge, is based on skepticism. Skepticism that knows no moral values and norms. So in the university, like I said, you're not taught the objective of knowledge. You're not taught, there's no spiritual nourishment within these places. It's simple information being relayed to you. Now as mentioned, this can confuse an individual. This will confuse youth, and Muslim youth are going in and coming out confused because there's no spiritual aspect to anything, there's no learning of the objectives of knowledge, and there's no understanding given to them of why they are in this university. Why are you here to study hadith? Why are you in a classroom in university to study hadith? Why are you in a classroom in university to study fiqh? Why are you here? Are you here just to take information? What are you going to do with the information? Do you understand? Whereas in the traditional sciences, they will first and foremost teach you the objective, the traditional method, sorry. The first thing is to learn the reason why you are going into these environments. Why are you here to study hadith? You will be taught. You're here to study hadith to understand the life of Rasul, to understand what Rasul was like, to understand Medinan society, to understand the deen which we have today, to understand aspects of the deen, how we carry out actions within the religion. This is what I mean by skepticism within the Western environment. The Western mind has, however, been able to exploit skepticism as a constructive force despite its weakness and harmful effects. So regardless of what people may say, regardless of some people may disregard the Western approach to things completely, but we have to be honest and we have to face this because Muslims in these countries are going into these places. They don't want to. A lot of Muslim youth, they don't want to go to the madaris to study. They don't want to go and travel and maybe sit with the scholars who have traditionally educated themselves. They would rather go into university, do 3 years, do a bachelor's in Islamic studies and come out and think they have all this knowledge, whereas when there's no spiritual aspect to it, when they don't know the first reason of why they went into these universities, and they become confused because they find a conflict of ideologies. They find a conflict of the ideology. They were taught this is correct, this is correct. And then when they go to the universities, they are taught no. If this does not comprehend, if this does not correspond, to the world around you, then it's going to be difficult for you to believe in it. And they will question a lot of things. So that's why you'll find confusion. The last point that I want to make here is any attempt of Muslim scholars to reform the educational system within the ambit of the Western epistemology would only promote Western values and ideas, because the Western knowledge, being a product of Western epistemology and Western worldview, can neither find roots in Muslim society and culture, nor can meet its demands. Now we have to, what I mean by this, Muslims have to create institutes now where we don't take the Western epistemology. This is not something which the Muslims have done, will do, and should do either. Muslims, we should not accept the Western epistemology. However, in terms of understanding and addressing the Western epistemology, this should be a factor when creating our institutes. We should create institutes which educate the student of the world around them, the modern world, modernity and its problems, and also train them in the traditional sciences, in the traditional method. Not completely disregard everything. This doesn't mean that a student cannot go into university and study. No, this means that if a student was to do that, they should understand why they're doing it, and they should first and foremost ground themselves. My teacher, before I when I came out after I did my studies, he said to me, Rafi, you've now built a roof over your head, go back and get a grounding now. Go back and now root yourself. Because what will happen is you will begin to go down certain lines, certain routes and channels which you have not been exposed to before. And you will think this is correct, this is correct. And you'll end up incorporating these values into your head, questioning certain things which shouldn't be questioned. As mentioned, the line should be drawn. Now I want to end, finally, and I'll leave maybe 10-15 minutes for some questions and answers. These are the conclusions. To conclude, I would like to mention how if one wants to go study Islam in a university environment, they should equip themselves and heed advice from the scholars they trust beforehand. Heed advice from scholars they trust beforehand. Scholars who have sat in the system of the traditional methodology, scholars who have taken from other scholars, whether that be from the East, whether that be from the West, and are trained thoroughly. We should take advice from them before going into the university environments wanting to study Islamic sciences. This is not a view against the Western methodology. This isn't something which is attacking the Western methodology. It's just simply stating facts, which I myself was taught during my study in England, during my study at the Institute in the University of Leeds in England. What the Western education does, it forces you to rethink, because it historicizes everything. Now you historicize, there's nothing, we should historicize things, we should historicize knowledge. Any information we get, we should historicize and contextualize. But, for example, the Islamic institutes of the East, Medina, Islamabad, Malaysia, Egypt, so forth, what they will do, they will build a building for you. You go study in these institutes, they will build a building for you. Now, after that, you go into the Western environments, these places will deconstruct this building for you. They will take apart this building of knowledge which you have gained, and they will tell you to rebuild it yourself, independently. This is what they will do, the Western environments. Any information, any knowledge which you had, they will question it, they will say, no, this is right, and they will ask you to rebuild that independently. Now, it's a fact that the atheists, the non-Muslims, the agnostics, and many other groups are trying to challenge the fundamental beliefs and foundational beliefs of the Islamic religion. You will get questions from everywhere. Questions from agnostics, questions from atheists, asking, questioning our fundamental beliefs, which the students will face on Western campuses, on universities. They will face these questions because you're not in an environment where it's just Muslims. You go into an environment, a Western environment, and it's non-Muslims, it's agnostics, it's people who aren't sure about the religion. It's many different kinds of people with many different ideologies and backgrounds. So these people are posing questions at the Muslim youth, at the Muslim students. Now, how do the Muslim youth students answer? How are they meant to face these challenges? If they're not grounded, if they don't understand, they will simply come out with a different ideology, question everything they've learned. Their building, which they've gained from, reading a few books and whatnot, is not strong enough. Whereas if you've had a traditional methodology of studying with the scholars for a whole number of years, 10, 20 years, whatever it may be, you will have that grounding, you will have the answers. You will know that the foundational beliefs should be unshaken. They will not be able to attack the foundational beliefs as they do in the universities. Now, many practicing Muslims go into these programs and come out thinking that they have enough tools. Now, this is a problem where the Muslims, I've written here, many young Muslims, they'll go into the universities, they'll come out thinking they've got sufficient tools, they've got enough information, they've got enough knowledge to deal with hadith, to deal with fiqh, to deal with whichever science it may be. And when they come and they're asked questions by the skeptic, they won't know how to answer them. What they find themselves rather is more confused, with more questions to ask. Now, with these institutes, what I said before is that a line has to be drawn. Now, if you want to historicize everything, this will lead to, for example, a historicizing of the Quran. Now, how can you do that? You can't historicize the Quran where the Western epistemology may say this verse is now irrelevant because this verse was revealed in the 6th century, 7th century Medina. How can you now take this verse? You can't take this verse anymore. And they'll pick and choose what suits them. They'll pick and choose what corresponds to the reality around them. Now, this cannot be the case for a Muslim, because wahi is wahi. Every single letter of the Quran is true for the Muslim. The speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, every single letter is true. Every single letter still applies and is relevant to this day and age. You can't pick and choose which verses I'm going to agree with, which verses I consider to be true to my reality, and which verses don't. So a line has to be drawn. When it comes to approaching these sciences in the university, a line has to be drawn in terms of, I'm not going to compromise on the Quran. I'm not going to compromise on certain things. You're not going to go and propose a PhD research proposal saying, I want to try proving that the Quran is not God's word or something like that. One of my teachers told me that this is just not fathomable. It's not possible within these places. You can't come and put a research proposal like that, because a line has to be drawn, as mentioned. You're not going to go and question everything and start historicizing the Quran now. The main purpose of Islam, what Islam means, is to submit. Is to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is to submit. So now if you're questioning and historicizing everything, if you're historicizing the Quran, if you're asking questions regarding which part of the Quran is true and which part isn't, etc., what's left to submit to? You're not really submitting to anything. There's nothing left to submit to. So you have to really be cautious when approaching these fields, in the university environment. If there's nothing left to submit to, then it's difficult to call yourself a Muslim if you're not submitting to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the whole purpose of being a Muslim. This is the whole objective of living our lives. We don't need to start questioning fundamental aspects of the religion now. You need to identify and focus, like I said before, as why you're pursuing Islamic studies. If someone is to pursue Islamic studies within a university environment, then by all means, but make sure, please, the advice which I would give to the Muslim youth and people in England, America, the youngsters who are thinking of studying, thinking of going into university study, is to first and foremost sit with the scholars, who are well knowledgeable in this field, in the field of Islamic studies. If there's a certain science you want to pursue, go for it, but make sure you have a good grounding first and foremost. First and foremost, Arabic. Most of the students, me myself included, do not know Arabic fluently. So how is it that you're approaching the religion of Islam, the science of Islam, without the language of Arabic? It becomes problematic, because now you can't understand classical texts, you can't understand classical opinions, you can't necessarily understand all aspects of the religion, because you're limited to the English language. So for example, I'm just giving you an example, but this becomes problematic for most of the students going into the university environment. The students I was surrounded by, I can count on my hand how many students knew Arabic fluently. There was only a few of them. And even then, they would ask questions. Why are we studying this? Can we really question this? Can we question this, etc.? Because they hadn't studied before and they hadn't got a grounding, a good rooting through the scholars, whether it be in Eastern institutes, whether it be in Medina, whether it be in India or Pakistan, etc., or even in England. We have the scholars in England. We have, alhamdulillah, we have the resources in England, America, Canada. We have many resources, and there's many opportunities for da'wah and to study Islam in depth as well. There's many opportunities to study everything you need, Arabic, any science you want to study. But now to not use these resources first and to completely jump towards Islamic studies or whatever it may be within a university environment is where the problem lies. This is where students will go in with a few questions, they come out with many questions. They come out confused, and they come out questioning the traditional sciences of the religion. They come out questioning certain scholars, saying, why are you saying this when I learned this in a university environment? But in the university environment, you can have non-Muslims teaching as well. You can have non-Muslim teachers teaching you sciences. Now, going back to the noumenon versus phenomenon view, a non-Muslim looking into the religion, not from the inside looking out, but rather an observer, will have many questions will have many criticisms about the sciences, because they have not ventured down the path of the traditional methodology. Now I want to finish here, inshallah. I'll leave 10-15 minutes or so, inshallah, for any questions that anyone may have. I hope this talk was beneficial in some way, and we have a brief understanding of some of the challenges our Muslim youth face, intellectual challenges our Muslim youth face when they are entering the university environments. I hope everyone can take something from it and gain something of what it's like for the Muslim youth in England, in America, in Canada, and these places, as they find themselves sometimes pushed towards these university studies, pushed towards studying Islam within these environments, not knowing which way to go. They don't know. Sometimes you get areas where, especially in places like Canada, I've heard stories where people, they don't have any shuyukh, they don't have any traditional shuyukh in the area. So the only option they have is to go to university and study these sciences in that methodology. Now in that university, like I said, you can have non-Muslims teaching you, you can have people who don't really agree with the aqidah or the hadith or etc. They don't really agree with it, but they'll teach you, and slowly you'll hear their own criticisms and their own thoughts creep into this systematic approach. They won't really know. Because they haven't got a grounding, they will pose questions to the students, they will pose questions to the students get confused, they come out with more questions than they had when they were going in. So inshallah I hope everyone can take something from this talk. I know it was quite technical sometimes in its jargon and etc. But I want to thank everyone for being here today. I want to thank the organisers, Jazakallah khairan, for everyone for organising this event, to Dr. Abu Ishi and the Dawah Project, Electronic Dawah Project. And if anyone has any questions, then inshallah I'll be more than happy to answer. Jazakallah khairan.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu wa rahmatullah.
As you said, you need this traditional grounding before you come into the universities and study Islam. But say, for example, if you didn't have this traditional grounding, or you came as a non-Muslim, or a revert, or somebody looking into Islam, and that's the only thing they could find, what would be the answer?
So for example, as mentioned before, I've mentioned the incidents in areas in Canada where they don't have certain shuyukh, for example, and they end up going to these channels of university education. Obviously they will come out with questions, but that's why, this is what I'm saying, that there are people, the reverts for example, the people going in to these environments with no other option. This is why it's up to us as a Muslim ummah, as like I've said, the imams in the masjid. Sometimes they're happy just sitting in the masjid, giving a few fatwas here and there. They don't want to progress the thinking of the Muslims, Muslim youth. This is a challenge. This is what I'm saying. This is a challenge which is faced by the Muslim youth. So as a Muslim ummah, as the scholarly elite, they need to start putting their resources into building institutes, building opportunities for such people who go into these environments, come out with many questions. Because if they have no other option, then what are they going to do? They're going to go into the university, they're going to come out, they're going to have questions. They're going to look around them. They've not got the traditional shuyukh. They've not got the Muslim environment which they need. They're going to have these questions. But the thing, there is good in the university, there is good in studying the Islamic studies. I'm not saying it's all completely, the devil's work or something like that. But you have to be cautious, like I said, you have to be cautious in approaching these things. So as a Muslim ummah, the scholars need to now create institutes and speak to the Muslim youth and educate them on these intellectual challenges. Honestly, our scholars need to gain an academic acumen where they are able to answer these questions, these shubuhat which these students face. They should be able to answer these. We shouldn't be scared of these challenges which come out of the university and these ideologies. The scholars should be able to answer these ideologies, answer these questions which they may have, answer these things. So the brother asked the question, he's now gone. He should.
Jazakallah khairan for a very well delivered talk, Sheikh Rafi. I have a couple of questions for you.
A couple.
The first one is on
MashaAllah.
the back of the last question actually. If the cause of confusion and doubt is the students entering into a university environment to study in the first instance, what would be the value, if at all, to have a student, Muslim or non-Muslim, to learn Islamic sciences in such an environment?
You mean if they have a cause and doubt before they entered?
No, given that the cause of doubt are these institutions and what they may or may not deliver and cause for the student to think twice about his own beliefs. What would be the value? So beforehand, what would be the value in someone like that person or any student entering into a Western institution to study
the Islamic sciences? So what you find is students, for example, I'll take for myself, I didn't necessarily want to go down the madrasa route. In all honesty, I didn't think I could dedicate my time, and I had a few questions about certain sciences of the religion, etc. So I went down the route of Islamic studies in a university environment, and some of the students, like I said, I was saying just then in the previous answer that not everything which is offered in these environments is bad. Not everything. Not every single approach which they take is bad at all. But the route, meaning the epistemology, the way in which sometimes it is delivered, is where the problem lies. Now, for a student who is, as mentioned, traditionally grounded, he will be able to differentiate between these conflicting ideologies. So, for example, me myself, I was provided with a conflicting ideology, but as soon as I spoke to the local teachers, I was able to clear up these confusions. I was able to clear up these confusions in ideology. Now, if a student wants to, he may say, a student, for example, in a madrasa system, you won't get the opportunity to, they'll say, you won't get the opportunity to research in depth. You won't get the opportunity to produce a paper. You won't get the opportunity to further your academic career. You want to teach? You don't want to teach in a madrasa, you want to teach at university. Me, myself, I want to teach in university. Now, the madrasa system itself doesn't offer that opportunity. It doesn't offer me the opportunity of furthering or specializing specifically in one field, where I'm able to, in the end, produce PhD papers, produce thesis papers. Like, for example, I'm going to give you an example now. My master's thesis was on the female mufti. I talked about female mufti in the history of Islam. Was there a female mufti? Did there exist a female mufti, etc.? Let's be honest, like I said in the talk, that the Eastern philosophical methodology is not without flaws. It's got its problems as well. The madrasa system, whether it's Medina, whether it's Indonesia, Malaysia, Bangladesh, it has its problems as well. Now, would I be able to talk about the concept of a female mufti in these institutes? Would I be able to do a research paper on these things? Would I be able to discuss to what extent certain ideas existed or certain ideas are true? I don't think I would be given that opportunity. So, before your next question, the students, I feel, before they go into these institutes, they feel like this is an opportunity where I can further my knowledge. Now, they don't know the conflictions which they're going to face, but they think I can further my knowledge, I can do more research, and I can talk about topics which I wouldn't usually be able to talk about in certain institutes. I wouldn't be able to talk about the female mufti in an institute in Bangladesh or something. Do you know what I mean? So they might see this as an opportunity, so to speak.
I had a second question on the back of what you just said.
Absolutely, Mr. Waqas.
So if, this is the question, what makes you decide, by what measure do you decide that the Eastern methodologies are flawed? Are they, in fact, those measures, Western ideological measures?
Are they what, sorry? What was the last part? Are they?
Are those measures that make you think that the Eastern ideologies are flawed themselves Western ideological factors?
Imprints?
Yes.
Are they Western ideological imprints? I'm not saying that East...
Or more aptly given your talk, Western epistemological
concerns. I don't think the Eastern ideology is flawed. If I said that, then I didn't mean that. I'm not saying Eastern ideology, I'm saying Eastern methodology.
It's without flaws. You can't say it's without flaws, so it's...
Yeah.
So
but,
what makes us think that they are...
But the Eastern, you have to understand that the Eastern ideology, by Eastern, by the way, I mean the traditional method of learning. Sitting at the feet of the scholars, going in the madrasa, these things. The ideology is clearly not flawed. But the methodology is, I think there are flaws to it. Like, for example, I've just given you an example.
That's just my question. What's your measure? How do you know that they are flawed?
Because you get people going into these university environments. I'll ask you a question. Would I be able to discuss my topic of the female mufti in Medina University or institutes as such?
I think so, yes.
We're going to have to agree to disagree, but I do disagree with you because I know scholars, my teachers, for example, they've told me myself that the opportunities for research and to think, obviously we have limits on our thinking as Muslims. Like I said, the line has to be drawn. But to think, for example, the concept of the female mufti or the concept of whatever it may be, you are able to do this freely in the university, freely. You don't have to worry about, am I going to hurt someone's feelings? Am I questioning the history of Islam, etc.? Am I questioning certain shuyukh's thoughts, etc.? You don't have to think about these things necessarily. Whereas in the Eastern methodology, not the ideology, in the methodology, you may be restricted to exercise your research in certain things. You may be restricted to ask certain questions. You can ask questions, but now, as I said, you got historicized the Quran. You don't ask questions about things like that, because neither in the Eastern nor the Western methodology is that in place. Is exactly what you're going to submit to if you're going to ask questions there. But to what extent do the questions stop in the Eastern methodology? In the traditional methodology, do you get the chance to do extensive research papers and do extensive PhDs and develop your knowledge to that extent?
Are you asking me that question?
It's a rhetorical question. You can answer it by all means.
I think it is rhetorical because I know people who have studied in institutions in the East, namely Medina University, who produced doctorate papers and assignments.
I'm not denying that.
On things that you and I wouldn't think would be possible.
I'm not denying that though. I'm not denying that you can do doctorate. I'm saying, would they be able to do a doctorate paper on the same thesis that I did it on?
What were your sources, if you don't mind me asking?
On?
The Mufti, the female Mufti. Were they Islamic sources?
Most of them were Islamic sources, absolutely. I'm not, even if you have Western sources, is that problematic?
No, if you had Islamic sources, it would mean that they're a product of Eastern methodology.
Which is,
work.
that's fine. If they're a product of Eastern methodology, that's fine. But I'm saying today, in this day and age, there's been this restriction where we've not identified with the past, we've not identified with our previous scholars. Our scholars, they weren't scared of these things. They weren't scared of ideologies. They weren't scared to confront and ask questions and answer the questions. This is well known with our scholars, from the Ibn Taymiyyah to the Abu Hanifah to the Imam Shafi. These people, Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal, these people were clearly not scared of answering these questions, of facing the non-Muslims and being able to answer them. So why is it today that we restrict our methodology within the Eastern quote unquote, within the Eastern method? Why is it that we restrict some of our students? I know students who come out of the madrasa system and they say, I wasn't allowed to ask this question, or this question was too controversial, so I want to ask someone else. So why, you're sheikh, your teacher, should not be scared to answer these questions. If he has a deep grounding and a deep rooting within the Islamic tradition, if he was a true traditionalist. You know what the problem is? The traditionalists in certain areas of England, in certain areas of the Western countries, the people who claim to know the tradition, you'll find they don't know the tradition well enough. Because if they did, they'd realize that the shuyukh of the past, the scholars, the great giants on whose shoulders we are stood on, these people were never scared of these things. They weren't scared. They were equipped, they were well equipped, and all they used was Quran, Hadith, Sunnah. They looked at the Prophet ﷺ, his life, they looked at the model of Rasul ﷺ. Rasul ﷺ was never scared. Well, obviously he wasn't, but he received theological questions. The Sahaba received theological questions. The people after them received theological questions. They received jurisprudential questions. But they were never shy from approaching these things. Now what you find is in our madrasas, in our little madaris, you'll find products coming out of these madrasas. Yeah, Medina University is different. You get university environments. But I'm saying these madaris, they come out, they go in like a factory, rote memorize a bunch of things, they come out. If you don't know the implementation of something, if you don't know how that thing is used, then what is the point of memorizing it? Memorization in Islam classically has equated to knowledge, there's no doubt. But the people who memorized, classically, they knew how to use what they memorized. They knew how to use everything that they memorized.
I think there's a conflicting. We'll continue this another time.
We'll continue it inshallah after the talk.
Excuse me. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
I want to ask a question.
Okay.
Freedom of speech, I can support that the Western people are allowed to worship the mind, brain, logic. Is that true?
In the Western academic sphere, yeah, you will find that they, as mentioned in my talk, that they put the rational mind above all else.
God's will. Above the God's will.
Above God's will, yeah, absolutely. God, the issue of God and everything is a private affair for the people.
The second question: how, by mind, can we persuade them to embrace Islam?
The non-Muslims,
By
or
mind. Non-Muslims, yeah, non-Muslims.
through intellectuality?
Yeah.
Yeah, through intellectuality. There's, in all honesty, it relates back to Brother Waqas's question as well, in terms of we need to, and what I'm saying is, I'm not saying do not go into these environments. I'm saying go into these environments. But when it comes to these conflicting ideas, when it comes to shubuhat, doubts that we're faced with, why aren't we prepared to answer these things? Now, if we can answer these things, that should equate in them embracing Islam, in coming closer to understanding that Islam is the truth.
For example, what question is it?
What, sorry?
What are the questions that they think about?
The questions which they may think about is, if, like, for example, is Quran the true word of God, for example?
No. Their creed, their own creed, not ours.
No, but this, what I'm saying is, these are the questions based on their creed,
Yeah.
because the rational mind. Bear in mind, their creed is the rational mind. Their creed is aql, like it comes before everything. Yeah? They don't have revelation, or they don't see revelation as a part of knowledge. If they do, then it's secondary or comes later on. So now this becomes their creed of the truth around them. If something doesn't fit into this truth, it's not the truth. So now you have Quran where they'll ask certain questions, or even the hadith, for example, they'll say, how can this hadith be true if it doesn't correspond to my creed, which is the creed of rationality?
They have doubtful questions.
Yeah.
The question is how to answer these questions according to our creed. This is the question.
This is what I'm answering. I'm saying that the way you answer these questions is by knowing your creed well, is by educating yourself first and foremost in these creedal questions. Now, how do you educate yourself? Where are the people who are educating? This is the question I'm asking. The people who should equip you with the tools of these questions, they should be everywhere. Our ulama should be ready to give us the tools to say, okay, you want to go study in university, you will be faced with this ideology. You will be faced with these questions. You will be faced with such so. Now, if you don't educate yourself in these creedal questions, first and foremost, when you are faced with these, what happens? Confusion. Complete confusion.
So, question. Do you find it is dangerous for young Muslims to discuss Christian and atheists in the ball talk? You know that? And this is my first question. And second question, is it any defense mechanism for this ball talk, like well-known site for question and answers like this? As mashallah, you are highly, mashallah, motivated.
I'm motivated, yeah, but I don't have all the answers. What was the first part of the question? Sorry,
You find this is dangerous?
Oh, dangerous. Sorry, yeah.
In the ball talk?
No, I don't think it's dangerous. In all honesty, this is my personal opinion. I don't think it's dangerous to converse with Christians. Are you talking about converse or reading their literature?
No, between young Muslims, like
Yeah, between-
young youth, especially if he's not highly educated or is.
To converse with them. The concept is that in reality, when you're raised in countries like England and America, etc., you're going to have these conversations with these people, regardless of how much you try to stay away from these things. When you go into environments as such, young Muslims, I'm talking about young Muslims, you are going to face these conversations with the agnostic, with the Christian, with the atheist. And when you are confronted with these, I don't think it's dangerous. However, as mentioned, if there's not a solid foundation, then these questions, they will shake your faith. Your iman will be shaken. I've seen it myself. Your iman will be shaken, and once that is shaken, now what do you do? Now, do you just let it remain shaken, or because if the foundation of beliefs are shaken at the core, then that will have a ripple effect later in your life or at the moment, and you start asking other questions. This all leads from the questions with the Christians and the agnostics. But if you have a solid foundation before approaching these conversations with the non-Muslims, with the Christians, with the agnostics, by a solid foundation I mean a good level of knowledge, ilm, to protect yourself.
So, can anyone highly motivated like this, with the culture, with this Western culture, to make a solid database for the questions they are answering, for the answer, how to defeat, how to...
Of course. There's scholars now in the Western universities who are dealing with these issues. There's for example, my teacher, Dr. Mustafa Sheikh, he's at Leeds University. He studied extensively in the traditional methodology across Syria, Saudi Arabia himself here, and then he went in India, Pakistan, and then in England. So he's done both. He studied the Eastern methodology, and now he's a doctor in a university. He deals with these things. He deals with conflictions which the young Muslims may have. Professor Jonathan Brown, he talks extensively about these things. There's many professors in England. Dalia Mogahid, she's not a professor, but she also answers these questions which young Muslims may have. There's many professors. Professor Ian Netton is a good professor from England, based in Exeter University. He himself discusses how Muslims, young Muslims, should prepare their mindset, should ground themselves before approaching Islamic studies in a university. He specializes in these things. The thing is, we have these activities going on in the universities. Now what we need is for them to transpire past the walls of the universities and onto the layman, onto the narrative and the rhetoric in the masajid, for the layman, for the person going into the universities. If they're going to just be in the universities, there's no point. These ideas will remain there. Now these ideas need to be delivered to the people walking on the street, to the people who are thinking these things. This is the thing. So there needs to be institutions now created which do this, which take these ideas of the university, where the professors who have studied in both traditions understand both ideologies being conflicting and teach them to the youth. There needs to be these institutions in the middle path created. Now there are endeavours in the UK taking place there's a Dr. Akram Nadwi, for example. He's implemented an institute. There's Dr. Timothy Winters. He's implemented an institute where they teach Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy, and they teach you the objectives of knowledge, the reason why you should do these things. They're not just simple, either you go to the madrasa or you go to the university. It's not one or the other. You get a good middle path. So I think these endeavours need to be made, these ideas need to be taken from the university and delivered to the people in the street, delivered to people like ourselves. Myself, I'm a layman, and if I hadn't spoken with the scholars, with my shuyukh before I'd gone into these institutes, or if I hadn't spoken with them after, I would be in a state of confusion. A state of confusion where I'm questioning certain things which shouldn't really be questioned. I hope that answers your question.
Now, sister, do you have a question? Sister? No questions? The time is okay. So thank you so much for your coming.
Jazakallah khair. Any question?